This is the Scandal column, where we dig deep into the stories that promised us one thing and gave us another. Most people remembered Little Women as the ultimate comfort story, the story from their childhoods. It brings back that warm feeling, of warm kitchens, sisterly loyalty, and those gentle, also manageable growing pains. It's supposed to be a refuge, a place you can rest inside for a while. But for those of us who grew up as romantic readers, Little Women just it wasn't comforting. It was not comforting. It was a slow motion heartbreak, a very, very slow motion heartbreak. And if I'm being completely honest with you, it felt like a betrayal. You know, it felt like a betrayal. And that's what I want to talk about today on this episode of the Scandal column. Why romantic readers read differently. I think there's a certain kind of reader, and maybe you're one of them. That's the reader who doesn't really read for the plot. We read for the people. We follow relationships more closely than storylines. We're quietly tracking the emotional continuity of a book. We're watching to see who shows up when something breaks. We notice who remembers the small details, the small things, who checks in or who stays when everyone gets distracted or drifts away. Romantic readers don't necessarily care about the big cinematic gestures you may find in a book. We care about quiet loyalty. We care about shared language, those half sentences, those private jokes that only make sense to two people, all those really quiet touches, the ones, little hand to hand, maybe a look, a gentle look. We pay attention to those little details and we read relationships the way other people read maps. No joke. We're just scanning everywhere for those fine details that make a literally journey just amazing and adventurous. And when you're young, maybe you were 12 or 13 when you first picked up this book and you don't really have adult language yet for the things like attachment styles or emotional availability or relational patterns. Like, huh? You don't have words for any of that. So you learn it through a story. For us, fiction isn't just entertainment, it's rehearsal for the real life. It's how we got to experience or how we get to experience life beyond our four walls, beyond our everyday experiences and encounters. Before we ever meet love in real life, we practice it in the pages of our favorite books. We practice how closeness is supposed to feel, what connection looks like, and what kind of bond is worth protecting. And that's important, more important than we usually admit or would like to admit. I first read Little Women when I was 12, and I remember exactly how I felt. I was in grade 7, and my homeroom teacher just had a library in his classroom, and Little Women was one of those books that I picked up. And I was so excited. I picked it up because of the cover and because it was on like the best books to read, the list that I had somewhere. I don't even remember. And I it was such an exciting book. I remember I felt like I'd stumbled onto like a blueprint of some sort, right? Like it was a quiet instruction manual for how a soulmate was supposed to work, maybe. You know the one. You know the one. Jo and Laurie. They shared everything. They build elaborate imaginary worlds together. Like they spoke in half sentences. They understood each other so deeply. And even like their own little idiosyncrasies and restlessness, even those two survive grief side by side. And, you know, they see each other when no one else in the world quite does. And when you're a kid reading that, like something very subtle happens. Like your brain signs an invisible contract with the author or something where you think, okay, this is it. This is how it's supposed to look. Closeness becomes romance. Shared history becomes destiny. And your nervous system as a kid, it settles into that promise, that invisible contract between you and the author, right? So, and the something that nobody really talks about or wants to admit is that when that bond is forged between the author and the reader, it's devastating when the author then shifts away from the promise, right? So, for example, like because most of us don't learn what love is from people first, we learn it from patterns, we learn it from observation. For those of us maybe who didn't observe it within our homes as children, as youth, as young people, we learned it from literature. We learned it from movies. So we learned those patterns. And we also like absorbed the emotional logic from those stories along with along with the stories. And that's like before we even knew our first real world heartbreak. Like we were just kids. And before we knew, the language for red flags or boundaries or even what emotional maturity looked like, this was our blueprint. Stories such as these. And we learn what feels meaningful from these stories and what kind of connection feels real through these stories, as those are the only, in some cases, stories that we can relate and they're comforting. They feel good. They emote feelings of warmth, of a blanket and a cozy fireplace and a book and maybe a cup of, okay, like hot chocolate or something, maybe with marshmallows if you're not lactose intolerant. So that's the kind of connection really that the author builds with the reader, especially a young, impressionable reader. And then, of course, as is with this novel, Little Women, Louisa May Alcott, I think that's how I pronounce her last name. She pretty much says, "Oh, that contract that we signed, when you chose to start reading my book, and you invested emotionally into these wonderful characters that I built. Well, guess what? Like, I am canceling that." Jo says no. And as the reader, as a young reader, you're left thinking like, what just happened? Huh? Now, if you talk to like scholars today, they'll tell you like this was such a bold move by this author. They say that it was radical of her to refuse that expected ending of the time, right? Because during the time that she wrote this, marriage was the expected end goal, um, along with family, right? So she was fighting with her editors, her publishers, because because she didn't want Jo to be married at all in the book or to end up married. So she wanted to tell a different story that was progressive really for her time, you know, and not so and not submit to the expected ending. Now, look, like I appreciate that as an adult. Like I get it. I get it from the author's perspective, what her vision was for this wonderful masterpiece. I really do. But, but when you're actually like inside the story and you're not analyzing it from a distance, but you're actually living inside it, because as the reader, you're taken into the story. You're part of it. You are Jo as the reader. You know, like you're really rooting for her. And as many readers with our imagination, we really live the storylines, right? So when the author creates that distance then from the expected ending, as the reader, it doesn't feel brave. It does not feel brave at all. It feels like you're being gaslit. It feels like the emotional rules of the universe like are just like moved from your feet, like from under your feet. You know what I mean? Like the rug is pulled from under your feet. And nobody really explains why. And you're sitting there again saying, what? Because if you look closely at the story itself, nothing actually broke. There wasn't a betrayal. Like there wasn't actually cruelty. There wasn't any of that emotional collapse that you would expect from um, a failed relationship that would make like a relationship impossible between two individuals, right? The connection was still there between these two. It was still buzzing on every page. So, ah, it was a heartbreak. It was a heartbreak. The story spent hundreds of pages just teaching us how to read this relationship, only to then, like, at the very end, say that, yeah, sorry, you read it wrong. Like, maybe you should go read that again. Maybe you missed something, you know? And it just doesn't land. Like, it's just, ah, it's so sad. It's it's a heartbreak between a reader and a story. Really, that's what it is. It's a heartbreak between a reader and a story. And I, for one, have never been able to read that story again. I read it in elementary school and never again. I did watch the movie. Not the one released in the 2000s, but the one from the 90s, with Winona Ryder, I believe. And even then, it had deviated so much from the book. And I'm such a stricter when it comes to um, the novels and the stories that I enjoy. I want I want the movies to be exactly as I envision them in my mind, you know, and it always fails. So there's that. But here's back to the story here. This is the part that I didn't know when I was 12. So going back to Louisa May Alcott, because, you know, I'm not exactly 100% sure how to pronounce her last name. Is it Alcott? Occult? Occult? I don't know. Anyways, she didn't want to get Jo married at all. I've already said that. Not to Laurie, and honestly, apparently not even to Professor Bear. She did not want that at all. She was she was like, according to my research, was being pressured by her publisher um to give Jo like a proper ending, like a proper romantic ending, because they were just like, girl, this is too much. You cannot do this to your readers. Like, you cannot just not, like, you cannot just have Jo end up alone. That is, you are not, are you serious? So, yeah, she decided then to give Jo a husband. But I feel like in her own way, she was really rebellious. And she was like, oh, yeah, you want me to give her a husband? Fine. I'll give you a husband that, you know, for Jo, or I'll give Jo a husband that the audience will not love, will not want really. And like, was the professor cool? He was okay, but he wasn't Laurie. He wasn't Laurie. So what Miss Louisa May did was essentially she wrote against her own readers to prove a point. And to me, that's the greatest betrayal. Bec- to me personally, I understand like she wanted to show that a woman's life doesn't need a husband to be meaningful, or that like, you know, um, like ambition, you don't need romance or any justification in the romantic sphere. Like, I don't know. I don't really know. Like, she was just trying to be an independent woman, I suppose. That, she was trying to show that a woman could be like unapologetically herself and successful and all of that, and be complete without the need of like a husband, a partner, or family, in that sense. And I think while I appreciate that and I honor what she tried to do, I love the rebelliousness nature of it all, like what she ended up doing here. And that is, of course, Madame Louisa May. I love that she rebelled and created this masterpiece still. It just breaks my heart that as a reader, I was so invested, and I really I was heartbroken. So, and Jo was still, I think there was room for her to still like um to still maintain Jill's fire, um and her refusal to be small, and like and to still be like that ambitious young woman that we love and respect about Jo, and still have Laurie. Like, I think, like, I really think that Madame Louisa May could have worked that in, but you know, she chose what she chose, and while we respect it, I have some reservations. So I think all that to say is like two things can be true at the same time, right? Like, in this particular situation, I understand what Miss Louisa May was trying to do, and extort, and like she wanted to write a story that looks like freedom, right? But I think a woman can be fighting the patriarchy and still and still wound, I should say, the emotional imagination of young women without meaning to. And I think that's what she did. So she created a story that like expanded the idea of freedom, but at the same time, I think she alienated the reader a little bit. And um, the overall theme of what she was trying to achieve, I think, is kind of overshadowed by what she did by not satisfying the reader. And that is coming from just a personal opinion, how I felt reading this as a very young woman. So yeah, I'm not trying to blame her for anything at all. It's just what I experienced. having read her book, um, and how I felt, especially reading it at a very young, impressionable age. So it's a beautiful book. It breaks like, you know, cultural cages, I could say, in some ways. But at the same time, it it is that tension that the book really created for me that like just made it impossible for me to go back and reread it. It's not the book that I would um I think I actually read it twice, not once. I did read it twice, but all that to say, it's not a book that I would go back and say, did I miss something? How do I explain how Jo and Laurie really didn't end up together? Like, what I wouldn't go back. I it was too painful, too painful. I get really invested for sure. And by pulling Jo and Laurie apart, the book taught like a very, very painful lesson that, choosing yourself might require letting go of a love that wasn't even broken, right? Like the painful decisions that adults have to make. I didn't have to know that as a 12-year-old reading this. I would rather have kept my rose colored glasses on. I'm just saying. The other lessons here that um, kind of like the growing pains, I suppose, of the listen to me, of the book. I wouldn't recommend the movie. I would say go read the book. I'm just saying. Um, it there's another thing. It's as if like growth has to be like a lonely journey, you know? As if it's just like the more you become yourself, the more like it inevitably like leads to like it's at the cost of closeness to other people again. So it's like that lonely theme again. And I think that was kind of like subtle in the book. I remember just having that sense, especially like for women. Um, so yeah, I think it it kind of shapes shaped how I looked at life a little bit. Um, because like as women, we are always being prepared to choose whether it's like our work or our relationship, right? Growth or growth meaning maybe even like isolation or loneliness to belonging, right? To have children or not to have children, to have family or not to have family, and all of that. To have a creative life even versus to just be. Like there's so many things that we are always being kind of prepared or groomed to choose. That's through media, whether it's visual or audio visual. And I guess by visual I also mean like literature, right? Like books. Yeah, so that is what I gotta say about Madame Louisa May Alcott here and the like Little Women. Sometimes I think of an alternative version and what that would look like, where like Jo doesn't shrink at all. Um, she she's not, she doesn't become some like quiet little wife. Not that. I imagine like an ending where like her ambition and love are allowed to evolve together, like where two people like are allowed to outgrow old versions of themselves without outgrowing each other. You know, where that doesn't require like like emotional isolation. I would love an alternative ending because at the end of the day, the more you become yourself, I think the more you are capable of even deeper connections, right? Because you have a deeper understanding of yourself and who you are. And so then you can share more um, of yourself in a very authentic way. And I think that's freedom. And I think that doesn't have to come at the cost of partnership. Like independence doesn't have to be lonely and you don't have to settle, you know? Because ultimately I felt like the professor was Jo kind of just settling it in a sense. And it was just the way that Madame Louisa May set it up. So for me, I look at the story and I think many of us um carry stories like this one, right? Maybe it's a book that we read like Little Women or another favorite, and it trained our hearts in terms of like expectations. It taught us like how to want something, and then in that same breath taught us like not to trust that wanting, right? Like maybe for you it wasn't Jo and Laurie, maybe it was a different book, right? A different couple, or a different ending that rearranged your internal map of what life or even what love was supposed to look like. But we remember those stories. And it's not because they were like badly written or some such thing, right? Like with this book, it's because of how they shaped us, because of the imprint they left on our hearts and our minds. Like that is it. So I respect the message Louisa May Alcott was sending here. I really do. But as the reader who was shaped by those pages and who was really invested in Little Women and especially in Jo and Laurie, I have to admit that I was hurt. It hurt. It hurt because the story taught me how to love like a possibility. And then it just shut the door in my face. So I know I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one. And like I said, maybe for you it was a different book, it was a different story, and it wasn't Jo and Laurie, but I want to hear from you. Which story trained your heart only to break its promise? Tell me in the comments. Let's talk about these stories that stayed with us like years after we, closed the book literally and figuratively. Maybe we never picked up the book again, like I decided with Little Women. It's not a book I would read now, again, ever. I wouldn't. I'm not interested in re traumatizing myself. So I want to hear from you. I want to hear your stories. I want to hear the books that you loved and the stories that maybe shattered your heart. Um, and yeah, I want to hear it all. And if you're interested in looking in the messy human truth behind all these classics and how they really affect us, hit the subscribe button. I'd love to hear more from you. And of course, I'd love to have you here for the next column. This is the scandal column, where the best stories aren't always the ones on the page.